The morning sun peeked through the expensive curtains of 58-year-old Margaret Winter's two-story house in Oakwood Heights. She was already up, dressed in her matching pastel tracksuit, hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. This was her favorite time of day, coffee in hand, standing by her large bay window, watching the neighborhood wake up. Margaret had lived in Oakwood Heights for nearly 20 years, the first 10 with her husband Tom, and the last 10 watching him slowly drift away until the divorce papers came through last spring. The neighborhood had been her constant, though, her domain. And since joining the Homeowners Association board 3 years ago, she'd taken her self-appointed role as neighborhood guardian very seriously. Another day, another violation, she muttered, sipping her coffee as she spotted Mrs. Chen's recycling bin left out a day late. Margaret reached for the small notebook she kept on the windowsill, jotting down the address and infraction with practiced efficiency. The HOA meeting was coming up next week, and she'd have plenty to report. The neighbors had a name for Margaret, though never to her face. Karen, they called her in hushed conversations at block parties she tried to control, in text messages warning each other when she was on one of her inspection walks, and in eye rolls exchanged when she interrupted the monthly HOA meetings with her list of complaints. "Not my problem if they can't follow simple rules," she often said to herself, unaware of how her voice carried through open windows in summer months. "Someone has to maintain standards around here." Margaret's house sat on the corner of Oak and Maple, giving her a strategic view of both streets. Her perfectly manicured lawn stood in stark contrast to the more lived-in yards of families with children and pets. No toys scattered about, no basketball hoops, no evidence of actual life being lived, just pristine grass and geometric shrubs trimmed with almost mathematical precision. After her divorce, Margaret had filled her empty hours with neighborhood surveillance. It gave her purpose, a sense of control she'd lost when Tom left. Each morning followed the same routine: wake at 6 a.m., coffee by 6:30, window watch by 7. By 8, she'd have documented any suspicious activities or rule violations that might threaten property values. The neighbors weren't just annoyed, they were tired. Tired of finding HOA violation notices for minor infractions like basketball hoops left out overnight or garbage cans not brought in by sunset. Tired of Margaret calling the city about noise complaints when children played outside after 7 p.m. Tired of her stopping by with friendly reminders about grass length or fence paint colors. "That woman needs a hobby that doesn't involve policing the rest of us," sighed Raj Patel as he hurried to move his garbage bins after spotting Margaret watching from her window. His wife Priya nodded in agreement, having received 3 notices last summer about their children's chalk drawings on their own driveway. Margaret remained oblivious to how the neighborhood actually viewed her. In her mind, she was the dedicated protector of Oakwood Heights' reputation and property values. She couldn't understand why nobody thanked her for her vigilance or why she wasn't invited to neighborhood barbecues anymore. As the morning progressed, Margaret finished her coffee and prepared for her daily walk around the block, clipboard in hand, phone at the ready to document any infractions. The neighbors had developed an early warning system. The eagle is flying texts would ping across phones, alerting everyone to bring in garbage cans, quiet children, or hide any unapproved decorations. Little did Margaret know that this Tuesday morning would be different from all the others. As she adjusted her visor and slipped her feet into her walking shoes, she had no idea that her world was about to collide with people who would challenge everything she thought she knew about her neighborhood and herself. In just a few hours, Margaret Winters would make a decision that would ripple through Oakwood Heights and beyond, forcing everyone, especially herself, to confront uncomfortable truths about assumptions, prejudice, and what really makes a community worth protecting. Margaret stood at her window, a fresh cup of coffee warming her hands. Tuesday was garbage day in Oakwood Heights, and like clockwork, the rumble of the sanitation truck echoed down the street at 9:15 a.m. She watched as the familiar green truck made its way toward her house, slowing down at each driveway to collect the week's trash. She recognized Darnell Johnson immediately. At 35, he'd been working this route for over 7 years, longer than most of the other workers lasted. Margaret had never spoken to him beyond an occasional stiff nod when their paths crossed, but she knew his name from the tag on his uniform. Unlike her neighbors who often chatted with Darnell or left him cold drinks during summer months, Margaret kept her distance. Something about him made her uneasy, though she'd never admit why. They should be working faster, she muttered to herself, noting the time. Tax dollars at work. As the truck approached the Patel house 3 doors down, Margaret noticed something unusual. A young woman was standing near the curb, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She wore jeans, sneakers, and a light blue t-shirt with something written across the front that Margaret couldn't make out. The girl looked to be in her mid-20s, definitely not from the neighborhood. Margaret would have remembered her. What happened next made Margaret's spine stiffen. When the truck stopped, Darnell hopped down from his position at the back, and the young woman walked right up to him. They weren't just talking, they were smiling, laughing even. The girl gestured enthusiastically with her hands as she spoke, and Darnell nodded, clearly engaged in the conversation. "What on earth?" Margaret whispered, pressing closer to the window. She squinted, trying to make out what they were saying. The conversation went on for nearly 5 minutes, 5 minutes that Darnell should have been working, in Margaret's opinion. Then, to her growing alarm, the young woman pulled something from her backpack. A small package of some sort. She handed it to Darnell, who looked around quickly before accepting it. "I knew it," Margaret gasped, nearly spilling her coffee. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them innocent. Drug deal. Has to be. When Darnell pulled out his phone and the young woman did the same, apparently exchanging numbers, Margaret's suspicions solidified into certainty. Who else but a dealer would be meeting a garbage man during his route? And the girl, she looked so young, so vulnerable. Surely she was being taken advantage of. Margaret set down her coffee cup with a decisive thud. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly with adrenaline. She'd seen enough crime shows to know that neighborhoods could fall apart once drugs moved in. And a young white girl mixed up with. Well, Margaret didn't want to finish that thought, but her fingers were already dialing 911. "Oakwood Heights Police Department, what's your emergency?" A female voice answered. "Yes, hello. This is Margaret Winters at 342 Oak Street," she said, keeping her voice low as though she might be overheard. "I need to report suspicious activity. There's a garbage collector who's clearly conducting some sort of illegal business with a young girl on my street. Can you describe what you're seeing that appears illegal, ma'am?" The dispatcher asked, her tone professional but slightly dubious. "They're exchanging packages and phone numbers," Margaret hissed. "He's supposed to be working, and this girl doesn't even live here. She looks like she could be in trouble or on drugs herself." Margaret watched as Darnell climbed back onto the truck, which began moving again. The young woman stayed on the sidewalk, making notes in a small notebook. She's still here, taking notes now. Probably keeping track of their transactions, Margaret continued, her imagination filling in details to support her narrative. The dispatcher asked several more questions, which Margaret answered with growing impatience. Look, as a man who doesn't belong in this neighborhood engaging with a vulnerable young girl. Isn't that enough to send someone? Finally, the dispatcher relented. "We'll send an officer to check it out, ma'am." Margaret hung up, a sense of righteous satisfaction washing over her. She'd done her civic duty. She'd protected her neighborhood. As she watched the young woman continue down the street, following the garbage truck's path, Margaret had no idea how drastically her actions would backfire in the next few hours. Margaret paced back and forth across her living room, occasionally peeking through the blinds to keep an eye on the young woman who was still following the garbage truck down the street. Her heart raced with a mix of anxiety and excitement. This was exactly the kind of thing she'd been warning the HOA board about, strangers bringing trouble to their peaceful neighborhood. "I should call Betty," she muttered, reaching for her phone again. Betty Chen was the only HOA board member who still listened to Margaret's concerns without rolling her eyes. Margaret's fingers hovered over Betty's contact, but she decided against it. Better to wait until the police confirmed her suspicions. Then she'd have something concrete to report at the next meeting. Outside, the garbage truck continued its route, stopping at each house with Darnell efficiently emptying bins. The young woman trailed behind at a distance, occasionally writing in her notebook or looking at her phone. To any normal observer, there was nothing particularly alarming about the scene, but Margaret was not a normal observer. "They're probably casing the houses," she whispered to herself, taking notes on which ones are empty during the day. When the police car finally turned onto Oak Street about 15 minutes later, Margaret felt a wave of relief wash over her. Officer Rivera was behind the wheel. She recognized him from previous calls about teenagers using the community park after hours and the Lopez family's unauthorized Thanksgiving gathering that had gone on past 10 p.m. Margaret gave her reflection a quick check in the hallway mirror, smoothed her hair, and headed for the front door. She wanted to be ready when Officer Rivera needed her statement. This was her civic duty after all. The patrol car rolled slowly down the street, following the path of the garbage truck, which was now nearly at the end of Oak Street. The young woman was still there, now taking photos with her phone of Darnell as he worked. Photos, Margaret gasped. Evidence of their operation, no doubt. She stepped onto her porch just as Officer Rivera parked his car near the garbage truck. The young woman looked surprised by the police presence, while Darnell continued working, seemingly unaware of the situation unfolding. Margaret hurried down her driveway, eager to make sure Officer Rivera understood the gravity of what she'd witnessed. She could see him speaking to the young woman now, who appeared confused and was gesturing animatedly. Margaret quickened her pace. "Officer Rivera," she called out, waving to get his attention. "I'm the one who called, Margaret Winters." The young woman turned to look at Margaret, her expression shifting from confusion to something harder. Darnell had noticed the commotion by now and was walking over, wiping his hands on a cloth. His face showed concern but remained calm. "Ms. Winters," Officer Rivera nodded. "You reported suspicious activity." Yes, Margaret said, slightly out of breath from her brisk walk. She pointed at Darnell and the young woman. "I saw them exchanging packages and phone numbers. She's been following him all morning, taking notes and photos. In our neighborhood, where she clearly doesn't belong." The young woman's eyes widened. "Excuse me." Officer Rivera held up a hand. "Let's everyone stay calm." "Ma'am," he addressed the young woman, "could I see some identification, please?" "Of course," she replied, reaching into her backpack. "I'm Amber Collins. I work for Community Voices Media." Margaret interrupted. She handed him something. "Officer, I saw it from my window. They exchanged phone numbers too." Darnell spoke for the first time, his voice deep and steady. "Officer, I don't understand what's happening here. I'm just doing my job." He stopped working to talk to her for at least 5 minutes. Margaret added quickly, "That's not part of his job." By now, the commotion had drawn attention. The Patels had come outside to see what was happening. Across the street, old Mr. Wilson stood on his porch, watching carefully. A few houses down, Lisa Thompson had emerged with her barking dog on a leash, phone in hand, apparently recording the scene. "Ms. Winters," Officer Rivera said patiently, "what exactly did you see that suggested illegal activity?" "Well, they were clearly." Margaret faltered slightly as she realized how many eyes were on her now. "They were exchanging things." She gave him a package. "She doesn't live here, and she's been following him, taking pictures." "Taking pictures of him working," Officer Rivera clarified, looking at Amber's phone screen which she had turned to show him. Margaret felt the first twinges of doubt, but she pushed them aside. "Well, you never know these days. Better safe than sorry." Amber Collins took a step forward, her demeanor professional, but her eyes flashing with barely contained anger. "Officer, if I may explain what's actually happening here." Margaret crossed her arms. Margaret felt the first twinges of doubt, but she pushed them aside. "Well, you never know these days. Better safe than sorry." Amber Collins took a step forward, her demeanor professional, but her eyes flashing with barely contained anger. "Officer, if I may explain what's actually happening here." Margaret crossed her arms defensively as Officer Rivera nodded for Amber to continue. She had a sinking feeling that her Tuesday morning was about to take an unexpected turn. Defensively as Officer Rivera nodded for Amber to continue. She had a sinking feeling that her Tuesday morning was about to take an unexpected turn. The small crowd of neighbors grew as Officer Rivera stood between Amber, Darnell, and Margaret in the middle of Oak Street. The garbage truck idled nearby, its crew watching uncertainly. Margaret felt her cheeks grow hot as more eyes turned toward the scene. "I'm a documentary filmmaker," Amber explained, her voice clear and controlled despite her obvious frustration. She pulled out a laminated ID card hanging from a lanyard in her bag. "I'm working on a series about essential workers who kept communities running during the pandemic." Officer Rivera examined her credentials while Margaret shifted uncomfortably from one foot to another. "She's interviewing me for her project," Darnell added. "My supervisor approved it last week. I have the email right here." He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times before handing it to Officer Rivera. "So what exactly was exchanged?" Officer Rivera asked, looking from the phone back to Amber. "A consent form," Amber replied, pulling an identical paper from her bag. "Standard release form for documentary subjects. And my business card." She shot a pointed look at Margaret. "Not drugs. Not money. Just paperwork." Margaret felt as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly tilted. "Well, how was I supposed to know that?" she said defensively. "You were behaving suspiciously." "Suspiciously?" Amber repeated, her eyebrows rising. "By doing my job in broad daylight." Lisa Thompson from down the street stepped closer, her phone still recording. "Margaret, did you seriously call the police because a young woman was talking to Darnell?" "I was concerned about neighborhood safety," Margaret insisted, her voice rising slightly. "She doesn't even live here." "Neither does the mail carrier or the pizza delivery guy, but you don't call the cops on them," Mr. Wilson called out from his porch, his weathered face creased with disapproval. Officer Rivera handed Darnell's phone back to him. "Everything appears to be in order here. Ms. Collins has proper identification and authorization to conduct these interviews." Margaret felt a creeping sense of humiliation as she realized how the situation was unfolding. Still, she tried to maintain her composure. "Well, better safe than sorry. In this day and age, you can't be too careful." "Careful about what exactly, Ms. Winters?" Darnell asked quietly. It was the first time he'd directly addressed her, and something in his calm tone made the question feel heavier than it should have. Before Margaret could respond, Raj Patel spoke up from where he stood with his wife. "We all know what this is about, and it's not about safety." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the growing crowd. Margaret looked around, suddenly aware that nearly a dozen neighbors were watching now, many with disapproving expressions. "You've called the police on my son's birthday party for being too loud at 6 p.m., Liza added. "You reported the Garcia family for having 3 cars in their driveway during a family reunion. And now this." Margaret felt cornered. "That's not fair." "I follow the rules and expect others to do the same." "The rules?" Priya Patel asked. "Or your rules, Margaret?" Officer Rivera cleared his throat, clearly trying to defuse the situation. "Folks, I think we've established there's no emergency here. Ms. Collins, you're free to continue your work. Mr. Johnson, sorry for the interruption to your route." "What about wasting police resources?" someone called from the crowd. "Isn't that against the rules?" Officer Rivera turned to Margaret. "Ms. Winters, I need to remind you that 911 is for emergencies only. What you witnessed today was clearly not an emergency situation." "But I thought." "You thought wrong," Amber cut in, no longer bothering to hide her anger. "And instead of simply asking what was happening, you immediately assumed the worst and called the police on a black man doing his job." The bluntness of Amber's statement hung in the air. Several neighbors nodded in agreement while others looked away uncomfortably. Margaret felt her throat tighten. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She was protecting the neighborhood. She was following procedure. She was doing the right thing. Wasn't she? Darnell's coworker called from the truck that they needed to get moving to finish the route. Darnell nodded and turned to go, but paused to look back at Margaret. 7 years, he said quietly. "I've been collecting your trash for 7 years, Ms. Winters. Every Tuesday morning. I know exactly which house is yours. I wave to you sometimes when you're at your window. You've never once waved back." With that simple observation, Darnell returned to his work, leaving Margaret standing frozen in place as the weight of her actions began to sink in. Around her, neighbors were already talking among themselves, phones out, no doubt spreading the story throughout the neighborhood and beyond. Officer Rivera took Margaret aside. "I need to have a word with you about proper use of emergency services," he said firmly. The crowd slowly dispersed as Officer Rivera finished speaking with Margaret. She stood alone on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm morning. The garbage truck had moved on, continuing its route with Darnell back at work. Amber had stayed behind, sitting on a nearby bench and making notes in her small notebook. Margaret felt a strange emptiness in her stomach as she watched neighbors return to their homes, many giving her cold looks over their shoulders. In just 30 minutes, her position in the neighborhood had shifted dramatically. She wasn't sure what to do next. "Ms. Winters," Officer Rivera said, closing his notepad. "I've noted your explanation, but I need to be clear about something. What happened today wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a misuse of emergency services that pulled me away from actual emergencies." Margaret nodded stiffly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "More than that," he continued, his voice low but firm, "situations like this can turn dangerous very quickly. Mr. Johnson was lucky I took the time to assess the situation calmly, but not every officer might have that patience, especially when the caller implies criminal activity." The full weight of what might have happened began to settle on Margaret's shoulders. She hadn't considered that her call could have put Darnell in actual danger. "I'm issuing you a formal warning," Officer Rivera said. "If this happens again, there will be more serious consequences." He tipped his hat slightly and walked back to his patrol car. As he drove away, Margaret noticed that Amber was approaching her, notebook in hand. Margaret briefly considered hurrying back to her house, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Maybe it was shame, or maybe a stubborn desire to defend herself one more time. "Ms. Winters," Amber said, stopping a few feet away. "I'd like to talk to you about what just happened." "I made a mistake," Margaret said tightly. "I've already been reprimanded by the officer." Amber shook her head. "This isn't about getting you in more trouble. I want to understand why. Why did you immediately assume something criminal was happening?" Margaret felt defensive. It looked suspicious. Anyone would have thought the same thing. "Would they?" Amber asked quietly. "Your neighbors didn't seem to think so." Margaret looked down at her sensible walking shoes. "What do you want from me?" "An apology." "That would be a start," Amber replied. "But actually, I want to offer you something." She held out a business card, identical to the one she'd given Darnell earlier. "My documentary is about essential workers, yes, but it's also about community connections. About seeing the people we often overlook." Margaret reluctantly took the card, confusion written across her face. "You made an assumption today based on what you saw through your window," Amber continued. "I'd like you to consider being part of this project, to sit down and actually talk with Darnell, to hear his story." "Why would he want to talk to me after this?" Margaret asked, genuinely bewildered. "Because that's how understanding happens," Amber said simply. "Look, when I started this project, I thought it would be about thanking the people who kept working through the pandemic. But it's becoming something deeper, about the invisible walls we build in communities and how to break them down." Margaret turned the business card over in her hands, not meeting Amber's eyes. "Darnell has been collecting trash in this neighborhood for 7 years," Amber went on. "He knows every house, every family's patterns. He's watched children grow up. He's seen elderly residents pass away and new families move in. He's more connected to this place than most people realize." Something about those words struck Margaret deeply. 7 years. He'd been part of her daily life for 7 years, and she'd never once really seen him. "I don't know," Margaret said finally. "I don't think he'd want to talk to me." "Actually, he suggested it," Amber replied. Margaret looked up in surprise. "He did?" Amber nodded. "He said sometimes people just need to see each other clearly for the first time." The two women stood in silence for a moment. From down the street came the familiar sound of the garbage truck continuing its route. "Think about it," Amber said. "My number's on the card. This could be a chance to change the story of what happened today." She smiled slightly. "Instead of being remembered as the neighborhood Karen who called the cops for no reason, you could be part of something meaningful." As Amber walked away, Margaret stood holding the business card, feeling as though she was at a crossroads. The neighborhood she thought she knew so well suddenly seemed different, filled with people she had never truly seen before. For the first time in years, Margaret Winters wasn't thinking about property values or HOA violations. She was thinking about connections, about seeing and being seen, and about the possibility of change. By that evening, Margaret couldn't escape what had happened even inside her own home. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications. First came the neighborhood group chat, which she rarely checked. It was filled with messages about the incident on Oak Street. Someone had posted a video, Lisa Thompson, no doubt, and neighbors were sharing it rapidly. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside her as she scrolled through the comments. Always knew she was trouble. Poor Darnell. 7 years of picking up after us, and this is how he gets treated. Time to vote her off the HOA board. That last comment stung particularly hard. The HOA board was Margaret's pride and joy, her way of contributing to the neighborhood. But as she read on, she realized the tide of public opinion had turned firmly against her. The doorbell rang, startling her. Margaret hesitated, wondering if she should just pretend not to be home. But curiosity got the better of her, and she peeked through the side window to see who it was. Betty Chen, the HOA board president, stood on her porch, looking uncomfortable but determined. Margaret sighed and opened the door. "Betty, I can explain," she began. "Margaret, I'm not here to listen to explanations," Betty said gently but firmly. "I'm here as the board president. We've called an emergency meeting for tomorrow evening. The incident today, well, it's gone viral." "Viral?" Margaret repeated weakly. Betty nodded. "Lisa's video has over 20,000 views already. It's been shared in community groups across the city. Local news stations are asking for comments." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face, but it was just a misunderstanding. "It was more than that, and I think you know it," Betty replied. "The board feels your actions today don't represent the values of our community. We'll be asking for your resignation tomorrow." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "But I've given years to this neighborhood. I've worked to keep our property values high, to maintain standards." "Standards?" Betty interrupted, her normally soft voice taking on an edge. "Margaret, what happened today showed everyone exactly what kind of standards you've been enforcing. And they're not the ones this community wants." After Betty left, Margaret sat in her living room as darkness fell, not bothering to turn on the lights. Her phone continued to buzz, but she'd stopped checking it. Instead, she found herself staring at Amber's business card, turning it over and over in her hands. The community's reaction had shocked her. For years, she believed she was doing what everyone secretly wanted, keeping the neighborhood nice. But today had shown her that her neighbors saw things very differently. Around 9 o'clock, her doorbell rang again. This time, Margaret didn't bother checking who it was before opening the door. She was too emotionally exhausted to care. Priya Patel stood on her porch, holding a covered dish. The aroma of warm spices wafted from it. "Priya," Margaret said, confused. Of all the neighbors, she'd expected the Patels least of all after how she'd treated them over the years. "I brought you some dinner," Priya said simply. "I thought you might not feel up to cooking tonight." Margaret stared at her, bewildered by this unexpected kindness. "Why would you do that? After everything?" Priya shrugged slightly. "Because that's what neighbors do, even when things are difficult." She held out the dish. "It's just butter chicken and rice, nothing fancy." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she accepted the food. "I don't deserve this." "Maybe not," Priya agreed with surprising frankness. "But change has to start somewhere, doesn't it?" She turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, Rage and I saw you talking with Amber after everything happened. She's good people. Smart. If she offered you a way forward, I'd take it." After Priya left, Margaret sat at her kitchen table eating the most delicious food she had in months, possibly years. The warm, complex flavors were nothing like the bland frozen dinners she usually ate alone. As she ate, she looked again at Amber's card, now propped against her napkin holder. The weight of the day's events pressed heavily on her, but for the first time, she also felt something else, the possibility of connection. She thought about Darnell, about his quiet dignity in the face of her accusations, about how he'd suggested talking to her despite everything, about Priya's unexpected kindness, about the community she thought she knew but clearly didn't. With a deep breath, Margaret reached for her phone and began to dial Amber's number. Whatever happened next would be difficult, embarrassing, and probably painful, but maybe, just maybe, it would also be the beginning of something new. 3 months later, the community center on Maple Street buzzed with excitement. Rows of folding chairs filled the main room, most already occupied by residents of Oakwood Heights and neighboring communities. At the front, a projector screen displayed the title Invisible Connections, the people who keep our community running, with Amber Collins' name underneath. Margaret sat in the back row, nervously smoothing her skirt. She'd almost cancelled coming a dozen times that day. Only Pryor's promise to save her a seat had given her the courage to show up. "You okay?" Pryor whispered, giving Margaret's hand a quick squeeze. Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. After the incident 3 months ago, she'd resigned from the HOA board as requested. She'd expected to be completely ostracized, but something unexpected had happened instead. Her participation in Amber's documentary had slowly begun to change things, not just how the neighborhood saw her, but how she saw herself. The lights dimmed and Amber stepped to the front of the room, looking professional in a simple blazer and jeans. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began. What started as a simple project about essential workers during the pandemic evolved into something much deeper, a story about seeing the people we often look past, and about how communities can break down barriers and rebuild connections. The documentary began with interviews of various workers, mail carriers, grocery store cashiers, nurses, and delivery drivers. Their stories were touching and often funny, revealing the humanity behind the jobs many took for granted. 30 minutes in, Darnell appeared on screen, sitting in his living room with his wife and teenage son beside him. Margaret felt her chest tighten. She'd met them during her interview sessions with Amber, but seeing them on screen made everything more real somehow. "I've been a sanitation worker for 15 years, Darnell said on screen. "People don't usually see us, they just expect their trash to disappear like magic." His warm laugh filled the room. "But we see them. We know which houses put out recycling every week, which ones forget until the last minute. We know whose kids are graduating from the yard signs, whose parents are coming to visit from the extra cars in driveways." The documentary cut to footage of Darnell on his route, waving to children who ran to their windows when they heard the truck. Then there was the incident. Amber's voice narrated as the screen showed carefully edited clips from the confrontation 3 months ago. Margaret's stomach clenched, but the footage wasn't as condemning as it could have been. It simply showed enough to explain what had happened. And then, to Margaret's surprise, she appeared on screen, sitting in her living room, looking much older and more vulnerable than she remembered feeling during the interview. "I thought I was protecting my neighborhood," Screen Margaret said quietly. "But really, I was just afraid of what I didn't understand." I never took the time to see Darnell as a person with a family, with a life, with a connection to our community that was just as valid as mine. The documentary continued, showing something Margaret hadn't expected. Footage of her and Darnell sitting together at the community center, awkwardly at first, then gradually more comfortably as they talked about their lives, their families, their connection to the neighborhood. "Sometimes it takes a painful moment to open our eyes," Darnell's voice narrated over the footage. "What happened that day was wrong, but what happened afterward, that's the real story." The film ended with shots of the neighborhood's first ever Essential Workers Appreciation Day, a block party where residents personally thanked the people who kept their community running. There was Margaret, helping serve food alongside Pryor. There was Darnell, laughing with Betty Chen about something. There was the whole neighborhood, looking more connected than it had in years. When the lights came back up, the applause was deafening. Amber invited the stars of her documentary to the front, including Darnell, and to Margaret's shock, herself. As Margaret hesitantly made her way to the front, an elderly man she didn't recognize reached out and patted her arm. "Takes guts to admit when you're wrong," he said simply. "Good for you." Standing beside Darnell at the front of the room, Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions. Lingering shame, yes, but also a growing sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. "You doing okay?" Darnell asked quietly as Amber answered questions from the audience. Margaret nodded. "Getting there," she replied honestly. "One day at a time." He smiled. "That's all any of us can do."